in terms of all of our submarines being alongside and unavailable for operations, this is really bad news. We are very dependent on those submarines for a number of elements that contribute to our core national security, whether that's Russian submarines or protecting our critical undersea infrastructure. We need these submarines at sea. We certainly need 2 or 3. At the moment, we have none. So it's really bad. It's a very long problem in the making, and it's happened before, and it'll happen again. But it's really bad operationally.
You called the current state of our attack submarine fleet a disaster. How many British hunter-killer subs are protecting our waters right now?
0. So yes, it is a disaster. We have 0, and there isn't even a way that we can play games on that and pretend there's one alongside that's ready to sail. The answer to that question is 0, and that's unacceptable. Something has to be done very, very quickly to try and reverse this. The problem is it's such a behemoth. The whole infrastructure, the whole organization is so huge and so resistant to change that it's very hard to know what to do to make this better. We just have to pay more money and do the things we're doing faster.
The Ministry of Defence always rolls out the phrase, "We continue to meet all of our operational tasks." Is that a flat out lie?
It is, and actually, were I minded to defend them, they have stopped using that line. I don't know if that's because I poked it so often, because it simply wasn't true. The last time they said it to me was when our carrier strike group was going around the world in 2025, and it didn't have an attack submarine with it. So like I say, this is not a new problem. It didn't have an attack submarine. Now, carrier strike group without a submarine in company with it can't defend itself against another submarine, not at all well. So and I called this out, and the famous line was trotted out about meeting operational tasks, and I said, well, it's just not true. That is, it's not true. And if you look at something like HMS Dragon, and it's how slow it was to get a single destroyer out of the door and towards Cyprus at the start of this latest conflict, again, there is no way you can say we're meeting operational tasks when that is the case. And in their defense, they have stopped saying that line. So it doesn't change anything, doesn't make it any better, but they have at least stopped telling what I thought pretty much amounted to a lie.
Zooming out in terms of geography, what is the High North area and why is it so critical to the Navy?
The High North has always been critical to the Navy and to the UK because it's the doorway to the Russian submarine fleet. And that is their most potent weapon in many respects. We've seen the way their surface fleet operates in the Black Sea. It's not particularly capable. We've seen the difficulty they've had on the land throughout the Ukraine war, despite huge numbers. But their nuclear submarine fleet has always been well run. And so you end up with this sort of double door system. The door that most people have heard of is the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, the GIUK gap, that sits sort of northwest, southeast across that gap there. That's the nearest door to us. And then beyond that, northeast of that, you've got the Bear Gap, which is between Norway and Svalbard. And these 2 doors, we need to be able to regulate those and the space between them, the Norwegian Sea, because it's pretty simple really, but the Norwegian Sea is 1/30th of the size of the North Atlantic. In other words, if their submarines can get through those 2 doors, they are then at large in the North Atlantic. They can fire missiles at will, they can get to our coast at will, they can get onto our critical undersea infrastructure at will. So if you want to detect and deter these submarines, which we do, then it's much, much better to do it at range and in these much narrower sort of 400 to 500 mile pinch points and do it there. So, and we've been doing that for decades. Ever since the advent of submarines, we've been pushing them up north, sometimes a long way north. Back in the Cold War, we would have one boat that would go through the Bear Gap and keep going, go around the top and start hoovering up information off Murmansk and places like that. So, it's a really important part of our naval operating areas, always has been. And if we want to contribute to NATO effectively, that's a good way of doing it. Let the land armies do land armying, let the maritime countries do the maritime threat, the maritime flank. And so us and Norway have always been really good at operating up there, but now we're not, because we've become so thin.
If Russian nuclear submarines do slip through the gap undetected, what could they actually do to the UK?
Well, in that case, it's a question of what are they actually doing now? What are they doing today? Because they sit off our critical undersea infrastructure. So there were 3 of them came around earlier this year. There was an Akula-Class submarine, which is one of their sort of nuclear attack submarines, quite aging, but still capable. And then they have this secret directorate called GUGI that invests solely in undersea infrastructure and spying infrastructure. And 2 of those were around as well. So they sent 3 boats. And we knew they were there, and we monitored them with what we had, and we used allies and so on and so forth. But they were basically sitting off the coast in the areas where the undersea cables pass. There are thousands of these cables that pass all around the world, but particularly between us and America. This is the ones they seem to sit on the most. And they pass financial transactions and all sorts of information. Everyone imagines that these things take place via satellite, but they don't. It's much more efficient to do it on the seabed, and has been since the 1950s. So they can tap into them. They can cut them. We know they cut cables in the Baltic. They've done that by dragging anchors. They could in theory place charges. So all these things are ready to be detonated at a time of their choosing. It doesn't really matter what they're doing. The point is they shouldn't be doing it, and we don't want them to do it. So we have to be able to track it and deter it when it happens. It also, once they're through in the North Atlantic, they're much closer, they're within missile range. Now, the likelihood of any of these submarines firing a missile at the UK mainland is very slim, thankfully. But again, in the game of cat and mouse, in the game of deterrence, you have to make it clear to them that if they were to try that, we could impose a significant penalty, by which I mean sink them back. So you've got to be able to deter in that respect. Then there's the business of our bomber. So our ballistic missile submarines, our nuclear deterrent. The key to that is keeping it isolated from all of this, from our submarines, from their submarines, so that they can operate completely undetected and with impunity. That is the key to maintaining a credible nuclear deterrent. So again, one of the reasons we need to stop their submarines coming through into the Atlantic is so that we can control that environment around our bombers. And incidentally, it's exactly the same for them. They actually call northeast of the Bear Gap, when you go into the Barents Sea, they call that their bastion, because that's where they operate their deterrent submarines. So they want to keep us out of there too. So this is not a one-way street. It's just imposition of real estate and controlling the environment that you want to operate in.
Can you explain the Yasen-class of submarines and the difference between the Akula and are they working on even better submarines?
Yeah, the Yasen is their new. The Akulas are quite old by design. There's improved versions of it, but what tends to happen over time is that you become better and better at maintaining your acoustic signature, or or dampening your acoustic signature. That is the key to a submarine success. Like I just said with the bombers, if you can operate without anyone being able to detect you, then you can operate with impunity. And there are a number of different ways of detecting a submarine, but the principal one still remains active and passive sonar. So an active sonar is where you ping, it hits the submarine, and you get a fragment of that ping come back to you. You can then process that and go, okay, that's the submarine. Passive is where you listen. You listen in across a range of broadband and narrowband noises, literally kind of trying to decipher that information. The ocean is quite a noisy place. Sea life and ice moves and just the motion of the water all makes a noise. So you've got to sift through that. So the more you can blend into that, the better. There are other ways of detecting submarines, sort of magnetic anomalies and wake detection and so on. And these are improving and getting better every day. But fundamentally, the quieter your submarine is, the better. And the Yasen has really just taken the Akula technology, developed over many years, and made it better. So they are now more stealthy. Their engines make less noise. Their hull makes less noise going through the water. They emit fewer frequencies that could be detected, or infrared, or other ways, non-acoustic means of detection. So it's just a step forward. In the same way that, in theory at least, the A boats that we have were a step forward from the T boats that went before them. you just look at the shape of the hull, it's much more sort of hydrodynamic. So yeah, it's a progression, and the Russians are progressing fast. I mean, that's partly because in the Cold War and in more recent years, their submarines weren't particularly quiet. They were actually quite noisy. So they've learned those lessons, and they're catching up. And the Yasen it's a good submarine.
Does this neglect of our nuclear submarines undermine our aircraft carriers?
Absolutely. Having no submarines compromises our ability to use our aircraft carriers, no doubt, because you now can't put the carrier in harm's way, which is the point of them. Everyone says they're obsolete because of drones, because of the threat. These are warships. Warships are supposed to go in harm's way. They're supposed to absorb a degree of threat. The problem is when that threat becomes too great. And in the case of an aircraft carrier, for a well-run enemy submarine, that is a very, very juicy target. And the threat from a heavyweight torpedo to the carrier is much higher than drones. No one ever talks about it because everyone's obsessed with drones today. But a well-run submarine going up against an aircraft carrier is a problem. And by far the best way to deal with that is having your own submarine. And so we can't do it. I mean, I did a war game just the other week, and it was the Russian submarine threat coming through the Bear Gap, coming through the GIUK gap, and we then had to defeat it. And I couldn't use the carriers because I wasn't allocated enough of our own submarines to keep them safe. So yeah, it's a real problem. And in an age where we are politically reluctant to use the carriers, we've seen a number of examples where we could have used them in the last few years and have neglected to do so because politically we're nervous about using them. We've become so backward leaning. We think it's always escalatory. Well, because that's just nonsense. But if underneath this timidity is the Navy going, actually, I don't think we can use them in this instance because we haven't got a submarine and it's therefore not safe, then clearly, that's not going to help. So yeah, the submarines have a key role with our carriers, and at the moment they're not fulfilling it.
What's the normal practice? I'm just trying to grasp the sort of shadow boxing. Is it a case of the Navy will just stalk a Russian submarine and just follow it non-stop?
Well, that's what we used to do. That's what we used to do when we sent ships, submarines round the top on the High North Patrol. We used to have one or two were normally called the special fit submarines. So they had extra kit and equipment, which is an area we've always been really good at. We've always been on the cutting edge of this tech development. My father did it, in the 60s and 70s. He went around the top in the special fit submarine. And yes, at that point, we would go right off their harbors and we would pick them up as they sailed and we would trail them. With, nothing is guaranteed. The whole world of anti-submarine warfare is ambiguous, but we had such a technical and operational superiority, we could do it quite easily. That's all gone. We've lost that skill. I was talking to someone the other day. I wonder how many of our current submarine community that are seagoing have been round the top and done that. I would say it's very, very few. We used to go under the ice and come up and surface through the ice. Again, under the ice is where the Russians want to operate their submarines. So it's important that we can do that too. I don't know when the last time we did that, probably 4 or 5 years ago, which means generally because of the way people rotate through seagoing services, there's probably no one left who did that. So it's all this gradual erosion of standards. And this is, I think, perhaps one of the most worrying parts to me, is that the standard of operational experience and operating experience will have been eroded in the last few years because we just haven't been sending boats to sea. We haven't been doing really punchy tasks like that around the top of Norway. And so the sort of training standards will have declined. How can they not? And the problem with that, in my mind, is that it's the sort of erosion that happens at such a slow speed. It's actually quite hard for the system to self-correct because it doesn't know it's happening. And certainly when I speak to ex-submariners now, they are all very worried about the safety of these submarines because we have eroded the experience in operating them to that level of degree. They're still brilliant in many respects. The way we operate our A-boats when they're working is effective. We clearly keep our deterrent at sea all the time, and to date have kept that safe. So it's not sort of Armageddon, but it's also not good at all.
Do you think there's assumptions being made about, the US being able to bail us out, or autonomous technology coming in and saving the day? What's your assessment?
Autonomy is definitely increasingly coming into the mix across all domains, whether that's space, surface, air, and subsurface. And the Royal Navy is working very hard through a project called Atlantic Bastion to integrate autonomy into our conventional systems, whether that's the aging Type 23 frigate or the emerging Type 26 frigate. How do they integrate with a series of webs and sensors that can, to a degree, mitigate for this lack of submarine business? But as ever, if you're using autonomy to replace kit, that's bad. If you're using it to complement, that's good. So, but it feels increasingly with autonomy, and the Defence Investment Plan the other day sort of reiterated this, that autonomy is being used as an excuse, as a cost savings measure, rather than a force enabler. So yes, autonomy will help. In the underwater domain, it's perhaps the hardest. We've seen what Shahed drones can do. They've shifted warfare. We've seen what quadcopter drones do over land in Ukraine. That has shifted the dial on the way of fighting wars. Underwater, because of the vagaries of operating underwater, because of the harshness of it, and because of the inability to communicate when you're there, you can't ping a satellite with data. So there's always a delay. You have to bring whatever your autonomous vehicle is up to sort of periscope depth, put up a mast or a buoy or an antenna. And at that point, you're vulnerable and you're late. That information has to go somewhere ashore. They have to process it. If they want that sensor to do something, i.e. become a weapon system, you've then got to ping the information back. And now it's too late. By the time it gets back down to depth, whatever it was looking for will have gone. So there's a real technical problem there, which is bound by the inability to communicate underwater. So yes, autonomy is key. We have to pursue it. We have to pursue it aggressively. We've got these extra large undersea vehicles now that I think are coming along quite well. Again, we don't have anything like enough, and we're not doing it fast enough. But it's a key part of this package. But there is no getting away from the fact that a 1.5 billion pound well-driven, well-run nuclear attack submarine is still the kingpin down there, and we've got to get ours back up and working and back out to sea.
Yeah, it seems a contradiction in terms of the nuclear deterrence being the bedrock of our defence and our national security, yet it's just been completely undone and undermined. Do you think that's just the Cold War peace dividend, just laziness?
I think lazy is a good word, actually. I think collectively that is what it feels like. We got, or maybe complacent. As you say, the dividend we just elected to spend elsewhere, and we had the umbrella of the US protection, and that was a mutually beneficial arrangement. They got to call the shots. They got authority over us to a degree. They got access basing and overflight across Europe. We were happy to give them that. We were happy to cede all of that because it meant we sat under their protective bubble. At some point, we started to take the mickey out of that arrangement. And I suspect it was kind of in the late 90s, early noughties, perhaps. We then got lazy and complacent and just overspent on everything else. And defense didn't help itself. Defense never tells its story particularly well. It hides under classifications. And so there's no sense of it. There's no sense of it to most people. Whereas, of course, with welfare and education and health, there is. It's in your everyday. Whereas a ballistic missile submarine that you hope to never use is as far away from most people's sort of mindset as you can imagine. So you can see why politically it was expedient to save money on defense. I think what frustrates me now is that those excuses have so demonstrably gone, not just increasing threat levels, but a visible reduction in support from the US. So put those two together, there is no excuse now for not spending the required amount of money on defense. And you've then got to spend it better. We can come back to that. You can't just pour money into this or it'll go into the void. But we do need to spend a lot more now. And the Defence Investment Plan really was another masterpiece in kicking that can down the road, putting a little sticking plaster on, talking about sums of money in some faraway time with no map to get there, so no certainty provided. It's a complete fake. So even now, I can forgive the previous governments of both types that let this wither. I didn't agree with it at the time, but you could see why. Now you cannot. And yet this government is spectacularly failing to address this existential threat to our country. And our sailors and our Marines, as they always have done, but increasingly so, are being asked to make up that shortfall by their own technical brilliance and ability to deal with this stuff. So it's profoundly worrying, and the government is not taking the opportunities it could do to change it.
Just looking at Ukraine now, we can see Putin is suffering. The casualties and soldiers killed is a new record for June. Is the risk even higher of a potential nuclear disaster? Can we see him lashing out, let's say?
Well, look, he's been saying that all along. He resorts to the nuclear threat very quickly, and then it dies away. So I'm not an authority on the Russian nuclear escalation ladder. It's in their armory, and a lot of their weapons can fire these tactical warheads, as well as their formidable strategic warhead count. So it's got to be there. It's got to be on the cards, and so that's what makes it so important that we can deter it. We can show a united front as a country and as a series of allies to go, don't you dare. And I think that's probably, as you say, he's getting more and more aggressive. At the same time, we're getting less and less capable. So that gap has to be widening. You don't need to be an escalation expert to recognize that. The gap between what he might want to do and what we can do against that is widening, and that's the gap that we have to address. And it's much broader than just defense. It's when you talk about defense reviews, it's very easy to zoom in on ships and tanks and who's got what. It's much bigger than that. This is about national security and resilience, and that needs to be addressed across Whitehall by all departments of state, and tackled as what we would call a whole ship sport, because it really is. It isn't bombs and bullets, tanks and ships. It's everything, from space to transport, and so on. And so if you look at it in that way, if this is reviewed by the government in that way, then the spending argument stops becoming about hospitals versus ships. I mean, that's the clumsiest way these arguments can be framed, and yet you see it all the time. So you want more bombs and bullets, that means you have to have less schools. That is not the way to frame this. The way to frame it is across all of these pillars. But you have to acknowledge first up that the government's primary, function is to provide security and prosperity for the country, and even those two are symbiotic. You can't have one without the other, and security is the one that we've neglected, and we now need to stop doing that.
You mentioned a long-term solution could be AUKUS. Can you just explain what AUKUS is and what they can do to help secure Britain?
AUKUS is the long-term solution to the current submarine problem we find ourselves in. Whilst we're putting money into autonomy, we're putting money into the nuclear infrastructure through things like Project Houston. AUKUS is a longer-term trilateral agreement between us, the US, and Australia to build the next generation of nuclear-powered attack submarines. And there's a couple of pillars within AUKUS, one of which is to do with technology sharing, which is quite exciting, actually, because submarine technology, by definition, is always very classified. And it's where us and the US have had a very, very close relationship over the years. And it's partly the sort of bedrock of the special relationship. Everyone talks about political name calling and the special relationship has gone, but that's not where it started. It started at intelligence sharing and military technology sharing. It's a really important sort of underpinning feature of our security. And we're good at it, and we're good at sharing it with the Americans. And now the Australians are on board. This could be quite an exciting pillar as part of it. But then fundamentally you get to big ugly attack submarines, and how many of those are Australia going to get, and then how many of those are we going to get? Because without AUKUS we don't get a replacement nuclear attack submarine. It's that simple. We've basically put our eggs in that basket. It's a very complex and fragile basket, but we put our eggs into it, and so AUKUS must succeed if we are to replace the Astute boats that are currently causing so many problems. So it's vital. And I think AUKUS is one of these things that's so big and so important that the cost is pretty much acknowledged by everyone. Whilst it's eye-watering, most people accept that this is really, if we're to continue having nuclear submarines and hopefully I've outlined why it's so important that we do, then AUKUS must succeed, no matter how sort of stormy and choppy those waters get between now and the 2030s and 40s when these boats start rolling out.